let me remind you that many of you will be sending me essays. Those of you who wish extensions will apply to Jerry Cohen, and he will be forthcoming in this, as he is, I believe, in all matters. That is my home address. I get mail at so many different places at Yale that it's hopeless to try to pick out a proper address, and I can't always be sure, But that is sure to reach me. Do me a great favor. It isn't lack of generosity on my part, it's lack of time. The only real post office for me is the abomination called Yale Station. It is an invariable ghastly line in order to have something weighed and mailed, and I will die if I have to keep mailing things back. So I urge you to do what I always urge my own students at Yale to do. Have pity. When you mail it off to me, you will have it weighed anyway. And I've learned this by long experience. Enclose a stamped, self-addressed envelope, and I mean stamped, even if they send off the thing to me with one of those machine things, labels. Those labels are not valid except for the date on which they are stamped. I've run into this hundreds of times. Yes, they are not. You will not get it back, and you will feel that I have defrauded you. So what you must do is send it in the right envelope, the one which has the post office, Schlemazel, but enclose something with ordinary United States stamps in the same amount. Then the other thing is, I didn't even know about this until today. That nice young man in the office told me, you have an option of a pass-fail option or a letter grade, presumably of the A to Z variety. So just say your preference underneath your name on the actual essay. Say either pass/mark fail or letter grade, and that will assist me. So let us look at the poem of the Auroras. This is Stevens on the verge of being quite old indeed. It is, as I think I said last week, his only poem in which he allows himself an overt personalism and indeed a certain degree of dramatic representation, not just of himself, but of a rather clear external scene, particularly in the quite extraordinary second section, or second canto, as he sometimes called it, of the poem. It is, from our point of view, and the reason why I want to bring this series of 14 seminars to a close on this particular text, is that the unifying factor, insofar as it has been one throughout all my meanderings and your participation as well, has been some version or another of what, for want of a better word, I've been calling a concept of facticity, or the literalizing of prior trope. Stevens is almost unique in that, I think quite deliberately, he moves that to the center of his concern as he gets older, and he shows himself entrapped in a facticity largely of his own making, in which he is literalizing, at least for a time, until he quite deliberately pulls away from it at the crisis point, or one of the crisis points of the poem. He shows himself literalizing not only prior tropes by others, including those of the tradition in which he writes, including Emerson and Whitman, but also British high romantics and Milton. But he goes beyond that. He shows the extent to which he is victimized by an over-literalization of his own prime trope, reducing to a first idea and then trying to reimagine it and trying to conceive of how you live with it and write with it. And one can even catch, I think, the two moments in which this is clearest in the poem, and then in discussion, I hope, try to work out how you move from one to the other. Certainly the moment in which one feels the oppressiveness of the facticity is the moment that I pointed to last week, and we will look at it at some length in a moment. It's on page 308, the second section or canto of the poem. He stares at the cabin. He stares. It is a beach scene on the Connecticut shore, down from Hartford, at a particular moment that he sets in the year, and it's a very traditional moment. It is the moment, after all, of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, or Whitman's As I Ebbed with the Ocean of Life. It is the actual moment in which summer passes into autumn, and as the twilight comes on and the darkness comes on, one feels, of course, a darkness which transcends the darkness of a particular, as he says, aging afternoon. But as he contemplates that, you certainly have the immense bleakness of the overwhelming transformation of a prime trope, the trope of what he calls never early candor, among other things, the primal whiteness, into a horrible solidity and over-literalization, which does incarcerate one, and incarcerate one indeed in the consciousness of death. In the fifth tercet on page 308, here, being visible is being white, is being of the solid of white, the accomplishment of an extremist in an exercise, and this is because of the north, which means the literal aurora borealis. And I want to talk about those northern lights in a moment. In the extraordinary, again, literalization of the powerful trope of blankness, the last 5 lines on page 308, the man who is walking, Stevens himself, the man who is walking turns blankly on the sand. He looks up and he sees off at the horizon and stretching up to the zenith, the extraordinary change being enacted by the aurora borealis. He observes how the north is always enlarging the change with its frigid brilliances, its blue-red sweeps and gusts of great enkindlings, its polar green, the color of ice and fire and solitude. And the particular moment in the poem, and I want to turn to it immediately, but we will not stay with it for now, in which quite clearly he unpacks this. He, as it were, unpacks this. He returns it to trope, and indeed refuses it as a negative sign, as he says, the third tercet from the end on page 314 in the 8th canto or section of the poem. So then these lights, the aurora borealis, these lights are not a spell of light, a saying out of a cloud, but innocence, an innocence of the earth, and no false sign or symbol of malice. And at that moment, certainly the whole movement of the poem has turned over, and turned over very much for the better. But let's set that aside for now. That is simply, as it were, the 2 dialectical poles between which it seems to me this extraordinary and indeed deliberately and successfully sublime poem proceeds. But let's look at something much more difficult for a while, as an exercise in reading, or the exercise, one might even say, of the imposition of a facticity, or the literalization of a trope. And let me ask a question, which is admittedly at first a difficult question, but we have been together for some time now as a group. It is perfectly clear where you are and what is happening at the opening of the second section. There might be some difficulty with farewell to an idea as to just what idea is being thrown aside or dismissed. And that, of course, is the phrase that opens sections 2, 3, 4, which are variations in apposition on a single theme. But nothing could be clearer than, and here again is that strange American style that I remarked in Whitman, and it is deeply indebted to Whitman. Interesting that even though they once had a celebrated fistfight in Key West back in 1934, Hemingway and Stevens, Stevens' letter recounting his famous victory, has since been published rather belatedly. It's a perfectly vicious letter. It does not remark on the fact that he was born in 1899 and Stevens in 1879, so in that celebrated fistfight in Key West in 1934, he was 35 and Stevens was 55. He doesn't bother to say that in the letter in which he recounts his triumph, his great knockdown, but actually it seems ridiculous that literary history should come to this. But they were both agonists of a very complex kind, and though they never liked each other personally, particularly after this occasion, in the letter he remarks how much taller Stevens was than he, and how much bigger, and how much fatter, and how much heavier he weighed, and so on. But they never gave up their admiration for one another's work. And though you might think that no 2 modern American authors have less in common, in fact they have a great deal in common, particularly stylistically, and the Whitmanian heritage has a lot to do with it. There is something not un-Hemingway-esque about this, though I don't think Hemingway ever writes quite this powerful as he can be in the early work. A cabin stands deserted on a beach. It is this declarative, plain style which is uncanny. It is white, as by a custom or according to an ancestral theme or as a consequence of an infinite cause. The flowers against the wall are white, a little dried, a kind of mauve, trying to remind of a white that was different, something else last year, and so forth. Hemingway particularly admired those lines, and if you know his work, you see why. But that isn't my major point. My major point is to say we know exactly where we are, and Stevens, for once, is writing a plain sense style. But I don't know anything more difficult, even in Stevens, not only some of the strangest parts of an ordinary evening in New Haven, than the opening of the auroras of autumn, and I want to see if we can surmise why he makes it so very difficult for you. Thus, I would say, to simplify it a bit from the start, that everything in the first section, down to the introduction of a second serpent in the last line of the fourth tercet from the bottom of the page, and find the serpent there, everything down to that point is simply an amplification of what he means in the line just before that by saying, these lights may finally attain a pole. But these lights, the auroras of the title, the aurora borealis, are not mentioned. Only the serpentine figuration and all its variants are mentioned until that point. And you have, therefore, in the Stevensian sense of abstract or abstractus, withdrawn from a stale context in order to make it fresh, you have a very difficult opening, an opening of the abstract kind, not opposed to the concrete, I repeat, but a notion of withdrawn from, and the withdrawing does make it rather difficult referentially speaking. And I want to know why. That is to say, what can one surmise? And I'd like to read the opening, and I'd like us to work it through with as much care, say, even as I say, to the point of sticking your nose through the page and coming out through the other side, as we did in working over the little poem, The Poems of Our Climate, last week. The reiterative phrase, of course, is this is, this is, this is, this is. It goes right through the thing, and it is a refrain binding it together, even in the inverted form of is this. And what is that this is? I mean, the real question is not the coupler, of course, the is, but what is the referent of the this? This is where the serpent lives, the bodiless. His head is air. Beneath his tip at night, eyes open and fix on us in every sky. Now, obviously, there's a withdrawal of affect from the start. It is very difficult to get the tonal stance, the emotional complexion of these lines. Or is this another wriggling out of the egg, another image at the end of the cave, clearly a Platonic reference, another bodiless for the bottle. This is where the serpent lives. Repetition, but this time not a comma, but cutting it off, the sentence at that point. This is his nest. These fields, these hills, these tinted distances, tinted, of course, by what? By the great lights which are playing over it, which utterly dominate, and the pines above and along and beside the sea, and then an attempt at giving a reading to the trope. This is form gulping after formlessness, and I take it that that is a gustatory image. It is the image of swallowing something up. Skin flashing to wished-for disappearances, and the serpent body flashing without the skin, a line which is referentially impossible, and yet which forces you to deal with it. Then an extraordinary line, almost the traditional line of the high sublime. This is the height emerging and its base. These lights may finally attain a pole in the midmost midnight and find the serpent there, in another nest, not this nest, not the nest of the this is, but another nest, a master of the maze of body and air and forms and images, relentlessly in possession of happiness. And here's the question that I would turn it on. This is his poison, which ends the sequences of the this is. What is his poison? That we should disbelieve even that. Let me perform a sort of Bloomian substitution, which I always drive anti-Bloomians crazy. What if it read that we should believe even that? How much difference would it make? What would the difference be? And how is that, in a way, an opening into these complexities, and I think a deep clarification? Surely it would already be considerable poison that we should believe even that. But he then insists, this is his poison, that we should disbelieve even that. Now this serpent always haunts him. It is the great serpent he calls ananke, or necessity, clearly related to the ananke of the myth of in Plato's Republic, clearly related to the ancient necessity preached by Stoics and by Gnostics alike, clearly related to what is called the beautiful necessity in that closing chant of Emerson's great rhapsody called Fate, in the conduct of life, clearly related to the necessity to which Whitman seeks to join himself under that very name in a poem like To Think of Time and all that retrospection. Why that we should disbelieve even that? So begin therefore with the question, how much poison would it be already that we should believe even that? And what would the difference between belief and disbelief amount to there? because certainly something different happens after that. You then move on to a passage that Hemingway rightly admired because it is pure Huckleberry Finn. And I say that, in the true sense. Hemingway insists in the book Green Hills of Africa that everything in American literature that matters. Boy, what a Freudian slip. That was about to be. There's a real sign of jet lag. I cut off the word marries. And I wanted to use the word matters, following Hemingway, that everything in American literature that matters comes out of that one book, Huckleberry Finn. And this is a very Huckleberry Finn vision of a very different serpent than the serpent one has visualized so far, or in either of his nests, the earthly one of the beach scene and everything around it, or the this is, which is Stevens' total context as he starts the poem, or that fantasized image of the serpent relentlessly in possession of happiness in some abstractus nest above. But this is clearly a very American serpent, a very Twainian serpent. His meditations in the ferns, this is clearly not the auroras. This is an actual serpent. This is a serpent of what Stevens elsewhere in Stylistic calls studying the nostalgias. His meditations in the ferns when he moves so slightly, unlike these extraordinary loping movements across the sky, the flashing, whipping back and forth of auroras in the sky. His meditations in the ferns when he moved so slightly to make sure of sun made us no less as sure. Clearly the us is ourselves as children, as Pennsylvania Dutch boys in Western Pennsylvania, in some scene remembered from childhood. We saw in his head, black-bearded on the rock, what did we see? The flecked animal, the moving grass, the Indian in his glade. Childhood images of freedom and innocence. And the whole question of innocence we return to very massively, as we saw when he avers, so then these lights are not a spell of light that's saying out of the cloud, but innocence and innocence of the earth, and no false sign or symbol of malice. So I come back to the question of belief or disbelief. Let me hear some voices on that, or a voice. What would the difference be if Stevens had written, this is his poison, that we should believe even that? It would certainly be poison enough.
Because it wouldn't be for us.
Yes, we are totally excluded from it, which raises the question, where are we anyway? You're an old man on a beach. I don't know how many of you have walked beaches, in that part of New England or further along the coast. I certainly have on Block Island, and seen a couple of remarkable displays of the auroras, rather like the one that he is describing here. It is a scary phenomenon. I must say I didn't like it any more than he did, even if being younger at the time. I didn't feel it in quite the same way. It can be an extraordinary thing when they really do smash across the sky. And the serpentine image is certainly there because they seem to lash across in all colors. They flash back and forth. But of course he's playing on something from the opening line on, which is partly going to lead one to the question of what it is that we are not in possession of. That unbodied serpent, of course, suggests what? The serpent traditionally, even before it came to represent, as it does in Plato, following the Orphics, and others following indeed early shamanistic matters that no doubt came down through Thrace to Athens, the serpent has always represented what? In every culture or folklore we know. A curious belief, partly based on natural reality, partly always fanciful. That a serpent does what, after all? That as an emblem of change, the serpent accomplishes change, yes, by the supposed ability to shed his skin almost at will, but of course very much as part, presumably, of a seasonal cycle. This is where the serpent lives the bodiless, because one thinks of him as shedding his skin. Now the image is, of course, prevalent in Shelley, always called by his friend Byron, my aunt, the serpent, because Shelley was always addicted to the image, following ancient sources to a considerable degree. Stevens had used it throughout his poetry. The grand poem Farewell to Florida begins, go on, high ships, since now upon the shore the snake has shed his skin upon the floor. The image of the closing chorus of Hellas, always in the ear of Yeats, who rewrites it so often, particularly in the two songs from a play that begins, I saw a staring virgin stand, and so forth, is the image of the serpent renewing itself the earth renewing itself, our not renewing ourselves. The final form of change is, of course, what, in human terms? As compared to the serpent. The final form of change has always got to be death, which is what I think Stevens meant from the beginning when on Sunday morning he says death is the mother of beauty, because, as he says finally in No Sort of Supreme Fiction, it must change in order to be a supreme fiction, in order to give an aesthetic effect. If it must change, it must also finally die. Therefore, death is the mother of beauty. Not a Keatsian use of that image at all, though it seems at first to be based on Keats's Ode on Melancholy, with, she dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. But the emphasis has changed in Stevens. This is where the serpent lives, the bodiless. But from the beginning, where does the speculation move? You have the Orphic image of the egg, you have the Platonic image at the end of the cave, you have the terrible, quite Freudian image of why you would visualize a bodiless serpent as you stare up at the auroras, why you would see that almost in spite of yourself. Because how does one read that third question, another bodiless for the body sloth? In Freudian terms, and this is quite a Freudian poem, quite deliberately, I think, Freudian poem, a naturally Freudian poem, you might say. As Stevens is, I think, the most naturally Freudian poet of the 20th century. How does one read that line, another bodiless for the body sloth? The question means what? Not as question, but really as statement. Why am I seeing this, he's saying? Is it an Orphic origin? Probably not. Is it a last Platonic delusion? Probably not. The more terrible question is, am I, as a wish fulfillment, am I, as a deferred fantasy, visualizing the possibility of shedding my own skin, because here I walk the beach world, I am old, I am impotent, my body is going. This is where the serpent lives. This is his nest. That is to say, he really does live here. The image of change leading on to death dominates the total scene. This is form gulping after formlessness. Skin flashing to wished for disappearances, which returns you to the element of wish fulfillment and the bodilessness, and the serpent body flashing without the skin. That is to say, am I merely visualizing some escape from the body and being dominated by this feeling of dread, though notice not once has he said anything that would justify my talking about a feeling of dread or a feeling of anguish. It is not expressed in the first part of the poem, and yet one learns to find it there in every trope. One finds it in the movement of every line. Why then believe or disbelieve? To come back to that we should disbelieve even that. If we believed even that, we would be relentlessly in possession of unhappiness, because only he, by breaking out of this nest to a higher nest, up there at the zenith where one is watching things. But this is his poison, that we should disbelieve even that we do not believe that this celebratory force up above is proceeding even to the happiness of the image of satisfaction, as it were, in itself. And so one goes back to an image, surely, of a serpent, which did give one an image of satisfaction, where the great charm perhaps is in when he moved so slightly to make sure of sun, which after all means what? What are auroras anyway? Stevens counts on you knowing this. The northern lights ultimately are emanations of what? What causes northern lights? Yes, they're purely a solar kind of a phenomenon. And they really represent not a making sure of sun, but a kind of flaking off from the sun because of atmospheric disturbances. And they move in effect so quickly because they cannot be sure of sun, to work out the implications of the trope here. But the serpent, of course, moves so slightly, he has no interest in darting or striking the boys watching him or the children watching him. He edges just ever so slightly. He moves an inch or two so as to stay in the sun, so as to bask in the sun, an image of satisfaction ending in that image of freedom, an Indian in his glade, which is to say what? In No Thought of Supreme Fiction, which I asked you to read, Stevens writes at one point very powerfully, an extraordinary statement of what he calls the motive for metaphor following Nietzsche. He says, from this the poem springs, that we live in a place which is not our own, and much more not ourselves, And hard it is in spite of blazon days. That is to say, even if there are days which blare forth or suddenly come forth in a kind of epiphany or blazon or emblem because things seem to go right. Nevertheless, we live in a place, and people come back to this at the end of the auroras, of course, in that strange series of rabbinical variations on an unhappy people in a happy world, because we do live in a place that is not our own and much more not ourselves. That is to say, we are under the shadow of mortality, and we are going to die. But everything in the visualization of the serpent in this poem has to do with living in a place that is your own and much more yourself. And presumably that is the image of the Indian, that is the image of the moving grass and the flecked animal. Yet all put with terrible indirectness. Why? Why do you begin with a section so obstructive or withdrawn, in which there is, as I said before, no palpable affect? There would, I think, be, even on the part of the most skilled or masterly reader of Stevens, had this been printed as a poem by itself, I would not know how to read it. You need the suite of poems or movement of the cantos that come after it, particularly the second, and you move into 3, 4, 5, to go back and see the attempt to which one is grief-stricken, to which one is already crushed by the northern lights. How negative the affect is, even though there is a total absence of affect in that first section.
Do you need prior poems as well?
Well, you may need prior poems also, or you may need a whole tradition of poetry, with a whole broad theme of affecticity. What do you take it is happening there? It is difficult. Let's try to follow it for a moment. Okay. Okay, and how has one achieved that refound sense of being at home, and thus being able to return to the image of the Lord? With what? Well, through the flippancy in a way, okay. Through the reassertion of freedom, but that leads to the further question. Is this desperate wish fulfillment? Why is it not subject to the same self-critique of asking about the bodiless for the body's sloth? Why is this not a fantastification or an image that you are passing on yourself? Why is it not a false sign or symbol that you're giving yourself as you dismiss the notion of the auroras as false sign or symbol? And that surely is what the rest of the poem has got to justify or maintain if it can. And of each other thought. And he returns to the image of innocence. By the way, this is almost certainly Nietzsche's peculiar sense of the earth, as well as what Keats is known either. In the text that haunts this text, the thought of Hyperion means, when she says to Keats, as the representative poet there, "Thou art a false thing, a fever of thyself. Think of the earth." Or like those admonitions all through Also sprach Zarathustra. Think of the earth. Return to the earth. What do these admonitions mean? Whether in Keats, or in Nietzsche, or in Stevens. The idiom of the work, in the idiom of an innocent earth, and against whom is this being put? Not of the enigma of the guilty dream. The master of the enigma of the guilty dream cannot be other than Sigmund Freud. The insistence on the idiom of an innocent earth is to return one to certain visionaries, including Keats and Nietzsche. Here's the instance of it. It begins with that strange trope out of Hamlet. Be you as Danes in Denmark, Hamlet says, when he greets the players. Meaning what? Be you as Danes in Denmark. Yeah, live in a place that is your own and much more yourself. You are fully welcome, all right? We were, the brothers, the siblings, we were as Danes in Denmark all day long when we were children, and knew each other well, hale-hearted landsmen, but with the outlandish was another day of the week, queerer than Sunday. We thought alike, and that made brothers of us in a home in which we fed upon being brothers. Now it sounds great, only he's about to ruin it, deliberately. Fed and fattened as on a decorous honeycomb. All is not well, clearly. This drama that we live, and you always watch out for images of theatricality in Stevens. To be at a theater is to be self-deceiving. This drama that we live, we lay sticky with sleep. we're in that honeycomb again, this sense of the activity of fate. This indeed sounds like the enigma of the guilty dream, and not the idiom of an innocent earth. And then lines which must have really devastated him, but which he writes with enormous power. He remembered all his life, and one would know this from two moments in his poetry, here and in The Rock, even if one had not, found it out. He fell in love with this orphan girl who was being raised by another Pennsylvania Dutch family, a girl sort of from the wrong side of the tracks, but very carefully brought up, who became his wife, Elsie. And he remembered all his life how when he had asked her to meet him in a solitary place, just to talk for a first time, she had come and come alone, as an act of faith, an enormous violation of the decorum of being brought up in that way in Reading, Pennsylvania, before the turn of the century. It may sound quaint to us now, but it haunts him. And I do not know how he could have written more beautifully. The rendezvous, when she, undoubtedly his wife, came alone, by her coming became a freedom of the two, and one feels a chill in this, because he's certainly making a judgment in a positive way upon what his own daughter said was the nightmare of her life, which is nobody else was ever invited into the house, an isolation which only the two could share. The self-knowledge of that is overwhelming, and almost eradicatory, it seems to me, of the freedom. I mean, one does not know what to do with that enormous a self-recognition, because what surely would strike all of us is terrible alienation is being celebrated here. The rendezvous, when she came alone, by her coming became a freedom of the two, an isolation which only the two could share. And I think one begins now to understand the dialectic of this flippant communication as against the enormous sense of a beauty in the heavens which adorns itself by our jettings and our extinguishings. Because look how this proceeds. On the one hand, you state the permanence of the act of faith that she made and the rendezvous of the two and the mutual freedom which is shared. On the other hand, what is this mutual freedom? The frightening question, absolutely unforgettable once you hear it. Shall we, myself and Elsie, be found hanging in the trees next spring? And he goes back to that wind. Of what disaster is this the imminence? Can only be death. Bare limbs, bare trees, and a wind as sharp as salt. And then returning to the grandeur of the auroras with imagery perhaps more sublime than anything previous in the poem or elsewhere in Stevens or perhaps in modern poetry. The stars are putting on their glittering belts. It is as though they're going forth to battle. They throw around their shoulders, and yet the glittering belts and the cloaks, the flashing cloaks, are clearly new ways of troping the serpentine movement of the great lights of the north. The stars are putting on their glittering belts. They throw around their shoulders cloaks that flash like a great shadow's last embellishment. It may come tomorrow in the simplest word, almost as part of innocence, almost as the tenderest and the truest part. What poet do you hear there, or the Stevens intended it at one off? It may come tomorrow in the simplest word, almost as part of innocence, almost as the tenderest and the truest part. What is that simplest word of the it, really? The simplest word. The sane and sacred word in Whitman. The beautiful, low and delicious word of out of the cradle endlessly rocking. The word whispered to one by the sea, and also presumably the secret of the murmuring I envy, whispered by the Father in one's ear, and as I ebbed, it can only be a Whitmanian reference to what? Death. What is happening? At this rather intricate but immensely beautiful point in the poem. What is he doing with that dialectic? And it is purely dialectical. On the one hand, a conviction now, because you have used all your powers and failed as a poet, that the beauty that you have perceived, and you now do see them as beautiful, I mean, what could be more beautiful as representation than, speaking of Aurora Borealis, the stars are putting on their glittering belts. The stars are seen as heroes rising up to a kind of battle or a kind of ceremony, what you will. They put on the auroras as their glittering belts. They throw the auroras around them as cloaks around their shoulders, cloaks that flash, and there's that flash of the serpent body flashing without the skin, like a great shadow's last embellishment. What's the great shadow? The great shadow's last embellishment. the image, as I've only realized recently, is certainly out of Shelley. What is, in actual fact, and therefore in Dante, and in Shelley following Dante, and in Stevens here, I think, following Shelley rather than Dante, what is the great image or trope of the shadow that the earth throws up into the heavens, upon which Dante plays again and again, and Shelley after him? The shadow of the earth thrown up into the heavens, according to Dante, according to the Ptolemaic view of the universe, Ptolemaic astrology, cosmology, cosmogony, astronomy, ends at what sphere? The sphere of what planet? And Dante exploits this magnificently. Whether you know it or not, you can guess it. In the Ptolemaic astronomy, the shadow of Earth, which is of course the shadow of mortality, flung up into the heavens, ends at the sphere of the planet. What would you expect in a love poet like Dante? Venus. Venus. And of course such it is in the Ptolemaic astronomy. And I take it that that is the great shadow. The great shadow is the shadow of mortality, as in Dante and Shelley, the shadow that our moving earth casts up into the fixed heavens of the Ptolemaic universe. The last embellishment of the great shadow of our death, of the earth cast up into the heavens, is the auroras. And that prefigures it, death, may come tomorrow in the simplest word. The simplest word is death itself. And now suddenly, the two things which had been in dialectical tension are dissolved as they are in Whitman into one another, almost as part of innocence. And that means, of course, he is surrendering to the most frightening, I think, of all American tropes, which dominates his poetry from now on, but has always been there, though he's fought it. The identification of death, night, the mother, and the ocean. That fourfold, which is total in Whitman's poetry, and which has been a kind of essential American trope ever since, he has been fighting for a long time. That is to say, the maternal image in Whitman, in Stevens, in Art Crane, of the tradition of American poetry, is at once the ocean, the night, death, and the form of the mother herself. The tenderest and the truest part of innocence must be the innocent mother, singing in the dark. And so there is a Whitmanian acquiescence here, but he doesn't end the poem there, and now I want us to slow down because we have time to slow down. And then I want to follow this back into certain parts of the poem, and then we will have time to look at two last lyrics of Stevens. But what about this rather extraordinary 10th canto on page 316, which is my personal favorite, I think, in the poem. Very funny indeed, and yet also, in the end, a little chilling. What is he doing in this section? He's writing variations on a theme. What's the theme? He states it in the first line: an unhappy people in a happy world. Read, Rabbi, the phases of this difference. That is to say, run a midrash over them. Run the possibilities by retroping it. All right, an unhappy people in an unhappy world. Here are too many mirrors for misery. Try it again. A happy people in an unhappy world. It cannot be. There's nothing there to roll on the expressive tongue, the finding fang, which reminds you of the serpent, but also tells you that there wouldn't be anything to write a poem about. All right, here's the fourth possibility. A happy people in a happy world. Buffo! A ball, an opera, a bar. No good. Turn back to where we were when we began. An unhappy people in a happy world. What do you do with it? Now, solemnize the secretive syllables. Read to the congregation, for today and for tomorrow, this poem, this extremity, the accomplishment of an extremist in an exercise, this contrivance, which is all that a poem is, of a human being, the specter of the spheres, if we live under the shadow of mortality, contriving balance to contrive a whole, the vital, the never-failing genius, the language is Emersonian, fulfilling his meditations, great and small. And these unhappy in ourselves, he, the vital, the never-failing genius, meditates a whole, the full of fortune and the full of faith. Language is highly Emersonian. But the next part is not Emersonian, as if he lived all lives. How can you live all lives? And then something very intricate, that he might know what? Well, you are told where he might know it, not in a hushful paradise, but in a harridan or hag-ridden hall. To what music? To a haggling of wind and weather, as in this poem, by these lights of the aurora. What are they like? Well, the last stroke for them is a blaze of summer straw. Summer straw goes up very quickly, gives you an immense illumination, but then is gone. And know it in what? Well, in winter's nick. Now, what does that New England phrasing mean? We speak of the nick of time, or being in winter's nick. What does that trope mean? A nick. By the way, the answer to my earlier question of what it is that he might know, Stevens refuses to say. It's just not there at all. He forces you to work it out by the syntax of the way in which he has said it. How has he said it? What does it mean to know in winter's nick, even if you don't know what you're going to know? What do we mean when we say in the nick of time? She came in the nick of time. Yeah, so nick means that final notch, to use a famous phrase of Emily Dickinson's. That is to say, one more notch and you are gone. Winter's nick, therefore, means that last notch before you are out of winter or anything else.
Or a niche, maybe.
Yeah, niche also. Nick of time, niche, notch. All the words are related. They're etymologically exactly the same word. But what is winter's nick? There are two highly dialectical, if not self-contradictory, possibilities for being in winter's nick.
One, the moment of death?
Yes, it can actually mean the moment of death, or curiously enough, it can mean the end of winter when afternoons return. Or it can mean the very end of winter and the start of spring, the final notch in that sense. He might know what? We are not told. How can that be? Look at the phrasing again. In these unhappy people in a happy world, which can only mean the world is not mortal, so far as we can tell. We are mortal, as we come to know more and more. In these unhappy, he meditates a whole. What whole? Contriving balance to contrive a whole. A purely aesthetic whole, therefore. Not a percept, not even a concept, but that which is suspended between percept and concept, which is presumably what we mean by a poetic image, as if he lived all lives. How can you live all lives? That he might know what? In Hall Harridan, not hushful paradise. Our paradise is imperfect indeed. It is so imperfect that we live in a hag-ridden hall. To a haggling of wind and weather. Why haggling? What does haggling mean? We think of it now, tropologically, as meaning bargaining. We haggled over the price. Well, what does it mean really as a word? A haggling. Quarreling. Well, it's not just to and fro, it's real quarrel. It's opposed conversation, it's different viewpoints clashing. So the wind and the weather are clashing with one another. And of course, what does the word weather mean? And Stevens knew this better than anyone. Weather just means two things. Literally, it's the same word as wind. Wet is wind. And weather always means, as Stevens' poetry keeps reminding you, because no poet is more obsessed with the weather, just two things: the movement of the wind, presence or absence of wind, presence or absence of sun. If you speak of a haggling of wind and weather, and you take the wind out of the weather, though the word is the same, then you mean a haggling of the wind and the presence or the absence of the sun. But the ultimate sign of the absence of sun is the cool death, the cooling death of the sun in the auroras. So there is therefore a haggling of the presence of the auroras and the movement of the wind, which until now has been doing the work of the auroras all through the poem, which has been an alternate form of the auroras, but now they're quarreling with one another. Now they're perhaps bargaining with one another. By these lights, we are illuminated by these lights, but like a blaze of summer straw. That is to say, it's a quick upward burst, and then it will be gone, and you will be left in the darkness of this oncoming autumnal night. But look, here's the surprise of it, and here I think he is following Shelley. Think of the famous close of the Ode to the West Wind. Wind indeed. But what is the close there, which is so strange? One of the most famous lines in English poetry, but we never bother to read it. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? But what one should expect, if Shelley were following it literally, and he's tricking us, he's choking us, is, O wind, if autumn comes, because that's what's been happening in the poem, can winter be far behind. Shelley refuses to end it that way. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? A rhetorical question, but deliberately inviting the possibility of an affirmation. Here, too, you're not in the nick of winter as you close this poem, you're in the nick of autumn. You caught the moment in the last notch of summer when autumn is commencing. But he takes you on to a point halfway beyond in the seasonal cycle, to the moment just before the coming of the spring. And in that he follows a Shelleyan antecedent, as curiously enough, whether Stevens knew this objectively or not. He must have known it on some level of reading, because that is what Whitman, again with palpable reference to the Ode to the West Wind, which he had pasted up in his notebook, cutting it out of the North American Review, is doing it as I echoed the ocean of life. What is this moving towards? What is this playing with? One cannot call this affirmation, and yet, though you do not know what you might know. Look, the vital, the never-failing genius is presumably that element, following Emerson, in the reader's sublime, in both poet and reader, which is insisting that there is some way to start out as tragically as this poem does, and arrive at, if not an affirmation, some possibility of meaning. And that in itself, of course, as current theorists tell us, is to at least pretend to the possibility of what was once called ontology or theology. But there's an insistence here that one is not just in language, even though it is a contrivance. This contrivance, look, read to the congregation, for today and for tomorrow, this extremity. An old man on a beach underneath the light of the auroras, an unhappy man underneath the happy gratification of these lights in their own glory. And in human imagination delighting itself by the extinguishing of the poetic and human hope, the lively hope of an old man on a beach. In these unhappy, he meditates a whole, the full of fortune and the full of fate. Now you cannot have both the full of fortune and the full of fate. If you have the fullness of fate, then there can be, in a sense, no fortune. Everything is overdetermined or predetermined. If you can speak of the fullness of fortune, then there is some possibility, not necessarily of the will, but of something which is not completely determined, as if he lived all lives. You have to live all lives if you are to know the full of fortune and the full of fate, because the two can only be combined in the coalescence of all our lives, that he might know what? Well, we can know something about that knowing, even if we cannot know the what. The what is unknowable, as Whitman says to the child, following Epicurus. And this is a very Lucretian conclusion, affirming the Whitmanian insistence that the what is unknowable. You can know in a place that is not your own, not a hushful paradise, in a hag-ridden hall. You can know with the wind and the weather beginning to part company with one another, even though they seem to have been at one all through the poem. By these lights, like a blaze of summer straw in winter's nick, seasons beyond where you are now, by the sudden illumination, something is intimated, but one does not know what the something is. Look at the death poem, because that is the only clue I have to what it is perhaps that you might be knowing. This is found among his papers, last poem in the book, page 398, of mere being. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. What does the word foreign mean, by the way, etymologically? Stevens always knows the finer edges of words. He's always playing on them, far more than Eliot say does. Yeah, originally, though, out of doors. Foreign means out of doors rather than indoors. Yeah, outdoors. Same root. Outdoors rather than indoors. Therefore, a foreign song in the outward sense too. And here's knowing again, which is crucial. You know then. But what do you know now? That it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. You're not told whether you're happy or unhappy, and yet there's no question, I think, in the tonality of this. But he writes this, going off to the hospital, knowing he's about to die of cancer. Extraordinary final vision. The bird sings. Its feathers shine. The palm stands on the edge of space. The wind moves slowly in the branches. And an extraordinary line, a line that he must have loved writing, because it returns to what he calls the essential gaudiness of poetry. the mode of the early book Harmonium. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down, and that dangling effect he's been playing with for some time. Fangled, of course, means fashion. And newfangled, the newfangledness that means new fashion. Dangling, marvelous word. Very American word, ultimately a word of flirtatiousness, very Whitmanian word. She dangled herself before him, originally meaning a certain movement of the hips, a certain movement of the body, a certain flamboyant sexuality. Look at the title, of mere being. Is the mere deprecatory, or is it a word in praise? Mere is a funny word too. What does mere mean? Something very close to, in some sense, what innocent could mean. Original. Very much itself rather than something else. So here's a poem celebrating being, but it's not human being, and yet it has human significance, though he denies that it has human significance. And it is a poem written, obviously, in contradistinction to itself. Why knowing, and how can you know that? Let me start that again, of mere being. Now that it is a poem is crucial. He had been reading Valerie's beautiful poem, Palm. Most certainly that got into this. But that image of the big, thinned palm angering for life, of that gorgeous poem, Nomad Exquisite, which he himself celebrated most in the Harmonium volume. Look at it for a moment. I remember asking you to read it. But I think the two poems play off against one another. What is it? Page 44. Lovely poem, written so many years before. I mean, he's writing this poem in 55, but this takes him all the way back. Beautiful poem. As the Nomad Exquisite, page 44. As the immense dew of Florida brings forth the big thin palm and green vine angering for life. As the immense dew of Florida brings forth him and him from the beholder. And there's that strong word, behold, rather than regarding or observing. Beholding all these green sides and gold sides of green sides and blessed mornings. And I think the finest line here, meet for the eye of the young alligator. And lightning colors, then the marvelous poetic abundance. So in me come flinging forms, flames, and the flakes of flames. Wallace Stevens recovered from the original version of it, the even more marvelous way it originally ended, because it had originally been written on the back of a postcard sent to the editor of poetry, and the last line read, fruits, forms, flowers, flakes, and fountains, which I wish he had kept, because that's so much nicer even. So in me come flinging, I'm on page 401 for this note, fruits, forms, flowers, flakes, and fountains. In short, just about everything overflowing at once. Now that is the early or naturalistic Stevens, being as unreductive as he can possibly be, before the snowman kind of reductiveness. There is a kind of vanished poet, because he could not continue very long in that vein at all. It was over by 1921. But if you juxtapose that poem to this, as it were, Valerian poem on page 398, what can you say about this poem? It is not a human or a natural poem. It is a poetic poem. It comes from the universe of Paul Valéry rather than the universe of Florida. And yet, Florida, too, which he always calls marvelously venereal soil, in every sense of venereal, sacred to Venus, but obviously taking the darker side of it also. The state of Florida will give him no plaques of commemoration for that one. But Florida, which is very much a state of mind in him, is not so far from his final vision, the palm at the end of the mind. What does that mean, at the end of the mind? It's a very difficult poem, yet curiously blunt. The palm at the end of the mind would presumably mean what? At the end of what? At the end of concept, presumably, but also at the end of percept. Because we conceive with the mind, but we also perceive with it also. The senses are very much part of it. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises. And look at the verb. You can, if you want to say, well, it's merely a sensory word. It has to do with apperception, but it has thrust to it. Even if it does not have the natural, it has force. It has vitality. It doesn't say it stands in the bronze decor. It says it rises in the bronze decor Yet by using the word decor, it's interesting, by the way, it shows that the editor who first printed this in the Opus Posthumous, Samuel French Morse, there's no basis for it whatsoever in the only typescript we have, and we have almost no Stilensian manuscripts. They never existed. He composed the poem as he walked along and then dictated it to his secretary in his office, and he would correct the typed sheets, but there's no process of revision as such, because the few things that we have clearly indicate he's just correcting typist mistakes. He is not reworking. He must have done the revision in his mind as he went. I suppose that means that he means the last thought of revision here also. That is to say, I can't write any poems beyond this, and I know it. So what do I end with? I see rising in the bronze decor. Now that bronze decor is clearly, as it were, in the Yeatsian sense, Byzantine. He may even be thinking of Yeats's death poems and opposing himself to them, as well as using an image out of Valerie related to the poem Palm. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor, so therefore does not rise in nature. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. There's some considerable reason, I would think, why that gold-feathered bird might sing without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. That bird is likely to be what bird? Its feathers are fangled of fire. They are fashioned or made of a fire. It can only be one bird, the phoenix, which is an image of resurrection. In the light of that, this looks different. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, which rises to the bronze decor, has a phoenix atop it. What's it?
The other thing, in French, poem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and whenever I hear that line, I always want to say the poem at the end of the line. And
well, he is thinking of Valerie's poem. We know that he had just reread it. It had always been one of his.
So that was.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, and there are deep affinities between this and that rather beautiful lyric of Valerie. A gold-feathered bird sings in the poem without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. It is outdoors. It is away from us. It should be. It belongs to that complex which still has a human meaning. Even though he denies it, it still has a human feeling. But he wants to estrange himself from that now. You know, the meaning or feeling of some hope for some mode of immortality, however you deny it, still has a significance only in terms of human meaning and human feeling. You know then, and this is Stevens speaking to himself, it is not often in his poetry that he addresses himself. No more than 3 or 4 times that I can remember. This is a body of poetry I know better than I know the back of my hand. I'm not much addicted to looking at the back of my hand, and I've spent much of my life with just this body of poetry. You know then, speaking to himself, why do you know it then? And what is it you know? Though he will not tell us that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. Now, obviously you know that you are happy. That is the feeling tone of these lines. And I do not think he means reason as compared to emotion. He means a specific reason, and I have a reason for saying that. You know then that it is not the reason. That is to say, it is not, I think this should be read not that you know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. It should be read, I think, I cannot prove this, as you know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. And then the bird sings. And look at the immediacy of the verbs in the rest of this. Sings, shines, stands, moves, dangle, down. Goes back to rises, presumably. The bird sings. Its feathers shine. The palm stands, now not just at the end of the mind, but on the edge of space. That is to say, where we can no longer visualize perhaps the forms of space and time, or presumably also if you reach the edge of space, then any image of the sun goes down and is gone. But then why this? The wind moves slowly in the branches. What does that do to it, if the wind moves slowly in the branches? So he has tried to set it out of nature. One wonders. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. What movement is he imitating in his own poetry? Probably the most famous trope in his poetry, which I think now he is recharging as trope, as if to say no more facticity, but making it yet more tropological, yet more figurative, is the famous close of Sunday morning. And at evening, in the isolation of the sky, casual flocks of pigeons make ambiguous undulations as they sink downward to darkness on extended wings. That is an image of mortality and nothing but mortality, however beautifully expressed. This is not an image of mortality. This is not a sinking downward to darkness on extended wings. This is a flamboyant and almost flirtatious manifestation. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. What is the effect of the internal rhyme, or the internal partial rhyme here? The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. The line with which he deliberately chooses to end this body of poetry. But to ask it another way, what's the difference in feeling tone, as it were, in stance, between the close of this little death poem and the close of the auroras of autumn? To a haggling of wind and weather. And now this. The wind moves slowly in the branches. It isn't haggling with anything. It isn't combating anything. Well, it moves slowly. Remember the image of the snake? The nostalgic snake? And it moves so slightly to make sure of sun. The wind moves slowly in the branches. The bird's fire-angled feathers dangle down. How can you read a line which seems to have, it's pure motion? And it isn't even necessarily motion, is it? Because the bird isn't moving. The wind moves slowly in the branches. The bird doesn't have to move. Merely by being that apparently phoenix-like creature is movement. The wind moves slowly in the branches, however slowly. The bird's fire-fangled feathers, the bird isn't moving at all necessarily, but the bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. It is a downward movement, but it is a dangling kind of a movement, suggestive of many, many things. What kind of a gesture is that? Difficult because it is so purely figurative. It plays on and against previous figurations. It is indeed that trope that I think one keeps naming transumption, not always to the applause of those who start away from it, but it's the trope that undoes prior tropes, including one's own tropes. It chooses freshness or earliness rather than belatedness of any kind. Well, if you introject, in the Freudian sense, if you identify with yourself or yourself with an image of earliness and you project or spit out or cast away an image of lateness, then even at the same gesture in which in a death poem you seem to be acknowledging death and making clear that your affect is not unhappy as you go to your death, you are being celebratory in the extreme, and you are certainly making an affirmation, even though the content of the affirmation cannot be parted from this image. He has been very careful. You can say, well, what affirmation it is to say that here we have at death the image of a phoenix, which is after all not a human meaning, a human feeling, but something which belongs purely to excessively abstract mythology, and indeed a mythology in the Stevensian sense not abstract enough, because has he indeed withdrawn this or pulled it out of its worn coverings and given it a fresh reality? And yet he has, of course, simply by the way the trope handles itself, not downward to darkness on extended wings, not ambiguous undulations as the pigeons dip down, but the bird simply sits there on the branches. Its feathers are so gorgeous, they are so much fangled or fashioned of the fire, they are so essentially gaudy, to use his own phrase, that you clearly do have an emblem not so much of human immortality, but an emblem of, you might say, the continued meaningfulness of a trope or a figure or of a poem, of a freshness which cannot be reduced to apacticity, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know really what you can do with that image, except feel that something, know even that something is being intimated about it. You know then that it is not the reason that makes you happy or unhappy. What is more than rational there is not even the image of the bird, It's the constitution of the bird. What is merely being in the bird, what is merely being in the bird, is that its feathers are fashioned or made of the fire. And to be fashioned or made of the fire is to dangle, even if down rather than up. Dangling is a rather defiant image. When you dangle, if you are dangling from a swing, it is an image of ill which there's a Freudian slip. It's time to end, including jet lag. It's an image of will which goes beyond slight caprice. What did I say there? And of course, oh dear. Uncle Sicky's revenge. Every time I do a graduate seminar on Freud at Yale, the 8th consecutive year, since this course, as I had managed to forget, to repress, was one period on Freud, he got his revenge.